The morning haze over the Philippine Sea carried a strange silence, thin, metallic, and expectant. It was the kind of silence sailors remembered decades later, because it felt less like weather and more like a warning. Before the first shell ever fell, the crew of USS Samuel B, Roberts D-413, already sensed the day would demand something impossible from them. The destroyer escort moved in a steady rhythm, engines humming at a comfortable pitch, her wake cutting a narrow line behind the escort carriers she had sworn to protect. Nothing about her silhouette suggested history-shaking violence. She was small, barely 1,350 tons, a featherweight in a heavyweight ocean, and yet, in less than 2 hours, she would choose a fight against the most powerful battleship ever built. It began with a faint shimmer on the horizon, a distortion where the morning sun bent around steel. For a few seconds it appeared harmless, like a mirage. Then the shapes hardened, peaks of superstructures rose above the curvature of the sea. Mast after mast emerged. Then the unmistakable pagoda towers of Japanese heavy ships, tall, layered and ominous, materialized from the morning fog. Reports from the escort carriers confirmed what the naked eye had already revealed. The Japanese center force had slipped past San Bernardino Strait and was now bearing down on Task Unit April 3, 77, Taffy 3, at battle speed. To Roberts' crew, the numbers carried weight: Yamato, Kongō, Nagato, Haruna, heavy cruisers like Chikuma and Chōkai, fast destroyers with long-range torpedoes and high rate-of-fire batteries. The entire formation dwarfed them in armor, guns, and sheer mass, and every ship in that shadowed wave was heading straight for the softest possible American target: the slow, thinly protected escort carriers and their lightly armed screens. The calm before the storm lasted exactly long enough for the brain to catch the danger, but not long enough for the nerves to steady. The first Japanese shells arced toward the carriers as graceful curves of distant thunder. Their explosions arrived as towering white fountains, plumes tall enough to almost brush the flight decks. The water slammed down in heavy sheets. Then the next salvo landed closer, and closer still. The range was collapsing. Samuel B. Roberts was positioned in the rear of the screen, and even from there the concussion tremors passed through her hull like blows from a giant's hammer. Her deck vibrated, her bulkheads shuddered. The entire ship felt small under the weight of battleship gunfire, even when none of it was aimed at her yet. The officer of the deck, standing beneath the open sky, understood the meaning instantly. The carriers could not survive this on their own. They were barely maintaining 17 knots, and the Japanese cruisers approaching were pushing 30. The escorts, Roberts included, were the only variables that could alter the equation, and they would have to alter it by force. The first command to general quarters sent a ripple of movement through the ship. Men dropped utensils in the mess, sailors sprinted down narrow passageways, boots slamming against steel, helmets in hand. Gun crews rotated breech blocks and fed ammunition belts. Torpedo crews cycled the air flasks on the Mark 15 tubes. Every man on board felt the sudden contraction of time. The attack wasn't coming soon, it was already here. Overhead, the sky dimmed as shell splashes rose in an unbroken ring around the escort carriers. White pillars erupted with a violence that felt volcanic, throwing spray high enough to reflect sunlight off airborne droplets. The air tasted of salt and propellant, sharp and metallic. Even at distance, the concussion felt like a pressure change inside the lungs. It was in this atmosphere, this mixture of cold reality and impossible expectation, that Samuel B. Roberts confronted her nature. She was never meant to fight capital ships. She was a convoy escort, a submarine hunter, a ship whose guns were designed for defense, not challenge. And yet the geometry of the battlefield left only two choices: fight or watch the carriers die. The decision formed not as a speech or a dramatic oath, but as a silent alignment of purpose. The men at the guns steadied themselves. The helmsman tightened his grip on the wheel. The engineering crew increased revolutions. The torpedo men checked gyro settings. Each motion carried the same weight. If they did not intervene, the battle would end in minutes, and the carriers, their pilots, their crews, and their mission would be lost. Then came the unmistakable shriek overhead. A Japanese cruiser had shifted its guns toward Roberts' sector. The shells descended with a keening metallic howl, splitting air with a sound that bypassed the ears and vibrated in bone. Their impact sent sprays of water over the bow. The next salvo would be closer. The storm had found them. In that moment, before the first hit, before the smoke, before the 80 minutes of violence that would carve their name into naval history, Samuel B. Roberts accelerated. Her bow lifted slightly, her hull bit into the water. Her engines strained, the ship began to move with a singular purpose, rising from escort duty, into the jaws of a fleet engagement she had no right to survive. The destroyer escort was now heading toward ships 40 times her size. The calm was gone, the storm had arrived, and the smallest ship in the formation was running directly into it. Long before the shells began falling, the roots of this impossible clash had been laid across hundreds of miles, dozens of decisions, and a chain of American momentum pushing deeper into the Pacific. By this stage of the war, the U.S. Navy had become the dominant naval force in the world, but even dominance does not eliminate danger. The Japanese still possessed weapons of terrifying scale, and they were willing to use them with the desperation of a nation cornered by fate. The Philippines formed the axis of these converging forces. Whoever held them controlled the sea lanes between Japan and its southern resource territories. Japanese planners, understanding this with painful clarity, crafted a bold, multi-pronged counterstroke designed to smash the American landing forces at Leyte Gulf. It was a plan built on deception: lure the American carriers north with a decoy force, then strike the invasion fleet from the west with heavy battleships and cruisers. If everything worked, the Americans would be caught off guard. If it failed, the last hope for Japan's naval war would collapse. And so, when Admiral Kurita's center force re-emerged from the San Bernardino Strait on the morning of the 25th of October, it was due to a combination of American assumptions and Japanese determination. The strait, thought to be guarded by larger U.S. carriers, had been left thinly watched, allowing the Japanese fleet to surge through at dawn, battleships leading, cruisers following, destroyers flanking. By the time the Americans of Taffy 3 spotted the pagoda masts on the horizon, the enemy was already well within striking range. Against this backdrop, the USS Samuel B. Roberts was not a ship designed for glory. She was a John C. Butler class destroyer escort, built for anti-submarine warfare, convoy protection, and auxiliary screening missions. Her main battery consisted of two 5-inch 38 caliber guns, reliable but limited when facing armored cruisers. Her top speed hovered around 28 knots in perfect conditions, barely competitive in a fleet engagement. She carried 3 Mark 15 torpedoes, powerful but few in number. Her armor was essentially non-existent, but what she lacked in steel, she compensated for in crew and doctrine. The American naval training pipeline by this stage of the war had matured into a precise, aggressive machine. Sailors on destroyer escorts were not second-rate. They were younger, faster learning, and deeply conditioned to react under pressure. Their gunnery drills were relentless, their ship-handling skills were crisp, their sense of duty, sharpened by the enormous stakes of the Pacific campaign, was uncompromising. Samuel B. Roberts' crew epitomized this ethos: adaptable, technically sharp, and quietly fearless. They understood their ship's limitations, but they also knew how to exploit every advantage: small profile, quick rudder response, disciplined fire control, and the ability to push boilers far beyond conservative limits. Although the ship was light, she was agile enough to fight in ways the Japanese did not expect from an escort. Meanwhile, the Japanese cruisers bearing down upon them had experienced a harsher path. Once the terror of the Pacific, Japanese naval aviation had suffered catastrophic losses through 1942 and 1943. Pilots, flight decks and carrier divisions had been reduced to shadows. The Japanese army was bogged down across Asia. The home islands were under increasing bombardment, and the Imperial Navy, once confident, almost untouchable, now fought with the knowledge that each operation could be its last. Yet desperation breeds courage, and the night before, as Kurita's fleet survived punishing aerial attacks in the Sibian Sea, the Japanese sailors had witnessed their own resilience. Their ships were damaged but not broken. Their pride, though bruised, was unshaken. The thought of crushing a vulnerable American unit at dawn gave them hope of regaining initiative. What they did not anticipate was the response they would receive from ships far smaller than their expectations allowed. As Kurita's heavy cruisers unfurled into battle line, their firepower spoke first. Massive 8-inch and 14-inch shells leapt from their barrels, the recoil sending ripples down their decks. Their salvos were timed, coordinated, precise, each one calculated to land near the escort carriers and bracket their movement. The Japanese believed they were facing a typical American carrier formation. They had no idea that the first ships they would engage directly were destroyers and destroyer escorts. From Roberts Bridge, the enemy formation appeared both awe-inspiring and overwhelming. The pagoda masts of the Japanese battleships towered above the horizon like skeletal skyscrapers. Their hulls threw sharp reflections across the water. The cruisers formed a dark, advancing wall, their wakes foaming in parallel lines like the teeth of a giant blade. Everything about them radiated menace, confidence, and destructive capability. But for all their power, the Japanese had a disadvantage. They did not yet understand the enemy they had found. They believed they were attacking a major carrier group. In reality, they were about to be stalled, delayed, confused, and repeatedly damaged by the most unlikely defenders imaginable. The American escort carriers, slow and unarmored, were already launching every available aircraft into the sky. Their pilots raced upward with half-loaded bomb racks, incomplete ammunition belts, and hastily topped-off fuel tanks. Above them, Wildcats and Avengers formed scattered, improvised strike groups. Their job was simple: buy time. But time had to come from somewhere. And that meant the ships of Taffy 3 needed to place themselves directly in the enemy's path. Samuel B. Roberts, sitting among the smaller ships, felt the currents of the battle closing in. The sea trembled with each incoming cruiser shot. The first splashes tightened around the carriers like a net. Spray whipped across the air. The world had narrowed to a simple truth: delay the enemy or die trying. She had 3 torpedoes, 2 5-inch guns, and a crew determined to fight far beyond their displacement. Ahead of her lay a formation whose total broadside weight exceeded anything a destroyer escort had ever faced. The geometry was impossible. The logic was grim. The odds were suicidal, but the mission protect the carriers was absolute. And in the calculus of American naval warfare, absolute missions produce absolute responses. Samuel B. Roberts increased speed. Boilers strained, the deck vibrated. The smallest ship in the formation was preparing to attack. The moment Samuel B. Roberts committed to the attack, the sea itself seemed to tighten. The destroyer escort surged forward, slicing across the wake of the escort carriers. With a suddenness that startled even nearby ships, her bow threw a hard curl of white water to both sides. Her engines, designed for steadier, slower convoy work, were pushed far beyond their intended limits. Boilers roared. Deck plates vibrated. Rivets trembled under rising strain, but speed alone was not enough. To reach the enemy cruisers, she needed angle, momentum, and nerve. The Japanese formation, advancing with predatory confidence, had now closed to a range where even the horizon seemed compressed by the scale of their fire. Heavy cruisers like Chōkai, Chikuma, and Tone were shifting targets as they adjusted their solutions. Their salvos arrived in deep-bellied blasts, columns of water erupting high above the superstructure of the escort carriers. Each spray came down in sheets, drenching flight decks and shattering aircraft parked at the edges. The concussion made the air feel thick, oxygen vibrating with each shockwave. Roberts' helmsman fought the wheel as the ship heeled sharply to port, placing herself between the carriers and the enemy line. This was the first moment of true exposure. The moment when the Japanese realized that the tiny American ships were not fleeing, they were maneuvering to attack. The first enemy shells aimed directly at Roberts fell short, exploding in a geyser that drenched her bow with spray. The next landed closer, hurling fragments across the foredeck. Within seconds, Roberts was bracketed. The gun crews opened fire. Her 2 5-inch 38 guns roared to life with a steady cadence, each shot leaving a coil of smoke twisting above the barrels. The ship's forward gun elevated, angled, and corrected with rapid precision as the fire control team fed range, speed, and deflection into the system. At this distance, hitting a maneuvering cruiser was nearly a mathematical impossibility, but delay, disruption, and distraction were within reach. Shells from Roberts streaked across the water, bursting near the superstructure of a Japanese cruiser. Even near misses forced the enemy to adjust course, complicating their firing solutions. Within minutes, the unexpected resistance created a ripple of confusion across the Japanese line. Their spotting aircraft had reported carrier targets, not fast-moving escorts aggressively firing at close range. For a moment, the enemy gunners hesitated, their commands shifting from certainty to reactive urgency. Roberts took advantage of the hesitation, accelerating into a shallower angle of attack. Her captain pushed the engines hard enough that the ship trails grew sharp and turbulent behind her. The destroyer escort was now running at near maximum speed, not just fast but leaning into the ocean, bow rising slightly as she closed the distance. Then the first accurate Japanese salvo arrived. 3 shells landed in rapid sequence, the shock waves slamming into the hull like physical blows. One exploded close enough to rattle every bulkhead on the starboard side. The sound inside the ship was like being struck by a steel hammer, deep, sudden, impossible to brace for. Paint dust drifted from the overhead, tools rattled in racks, but the ship held her course. A second incoming pattern struck even closer. A spray of splinters peppered the aft gun mount, tearing chips from the shield and sending fragments skittering across the deck. Yet the crew stayed in position, hands steady on the breech blocks, eyes locked on the horizon. Their discipline, born from months of drills, was the anchor holding the ship together amid chaos. Now the distance between Roberts and the nearest Japanese cruiser had narrowed to the edge of torpedo range. The Mark 15 torpedoes were the ship's only weapon capable of seriously damaging a heavy cruiser. Their warheads were powerful enough to split armor belts and rupture boilers, but they required precision, and the firing arc required Roberts to angle even closer to the enemy's line of fire. She turned, the hull groaned under the maneuver, water slamming across the port bow as the ship shifted direction. The torpedo crews opened the outer doors, their breath fogged in the cool morning air as they worked the controls, checking gyros and compensators. The tubes were angled, the firing solution adjusted. But the enemy was also adjusting. A Japanese cruiser, recognizing the danger, swung its guns toward the approaching American escort. The moment the barrels aligned, the world erupted. A shell detonated with brutal intensity, close enough to throw a storm of steel fragments across the deck. One tore into the starboard rail. Another smashed into a ready service locker, showering the gun crew in splinters. The concussion sent several men to their knees, but by the time they stood again, the torpedo solution was complete. The order was given. The tubes fired with a thunderous exhale, sending 3 Mark 15 torpedoes streaking beneath the waves. Their wakes curled out behind them like bright white scars on the sea. For a moment, a silent, breathless moment, even the gun crews paused as the weapons raced toward the enemy line. But battle does not pause. Another Japanese salvo closed in, this one landing almost directly alongside Roberts' starboard beam. The explosion sent an entire wall of water crashing over her decks, washing across the torpedo tubes and knocking several sailors momentarily off their feet. The ship listed under the impact, shuddering violently before righting herself. Still the guns kept firing. Roberts now engaged with a rhythm that defied her size, her 5-inch shells punching outward in a relentless chain, each burst marking another moment carved from the enemy's advance. Smoke drifted across the deck, stinging eyes and lungs. The smell of burning powder hung in the air. Every sound was swallowed by the crack of guns and the thunder of enemy fire. Then the lookout spotted something, white pillars rising where one of Roberts' torpedoes had reached its target. A Japanese cruiser bucked violently, a column of flame erupting from its hull. The hit staggered the formation, forcing neighboring ships to scatter their courses. For the first time, the Japanese line showed visible disarray, and for the first time, Samuel B. Roberts had changed the course of the battle, but the cost of that influence was rising. Shell after shell began to close the pattern around her. The enemy had identified the threat, the tiny ship punching far above her displacement, and shifted more guns onto her silhouette. She had made first contact. She had drawn blood. She had altered the enemy's advance. But now the Japanese guns were adjusting. The next blow would not be near miss. It would be direct. The hit that followed was not a glancing blow, nor a towering splash meant to intimidate. It was a direct, armor-piercing strike, one of the first of 10 that Samuel B. Roberts would endure in the span of 80 brutal minutes. The shell tore into her starboard side with a force that felt like the entire ocean collapsing inward. The detonation shook the ship so violently that men throughout the passageways were thrown against bulkheads. Lights flickered. Dust cascaded from overhead fittings. For a heartbeat, the ship seemed to stagger. But she did not stop. Damage control teams were already moving. They sealed hatches, checked steam lines, and shored up bulkheads with planks cut from emergency stores. In the engine room, gauges fluttered but held. The ship's heart beat, her boilers thumped in steady defiance of the punishment being inflicted upon her hull. The Roberts was wounded, but the wound had not broken her stride. Outside, the world had shrunk into a tunnel of smoke and steel. Shell splashes erupted on all sides, thick white geysers pounding the sea in ceaseless rhythm. Japanese spotting aircraft had now fully corrected their ranges. Their cruisers were firing with calibrated, mechanical precision. It was only a matter of time before the next hit landed. Roberts' aft gun kept firing despite the chaos. Its crew worked in a haze of heat, smoke, and adrenaline. Each cycle of the breach felt like wrestling with a furnace. Each shell they sent downrange was one more second carved away from the enemy's advance. They were no longer firing to score hits alone. They were firing to disrupt rhythm, to break momentum, to force corrections, to make themselves impossible to ignore. And they succeeded. A full cruiser division, multiple hulls, multiple gun batteries, shifted fire toward the Roberts. They had recognized the threat. This tiny escort, this small wedge of steel, was inflicting enough interference to threaten the entire Japanese timetable. If they wanted to catch the American carriers before they reached safety, they needed to silence the destroyer escort that refused to die. The next salvo arrived with terrifying accuracy. 3 shells plunged into the sea, off Roberts' port side within seconds of each other, their explosions pounding the hull so hard that men struggled to remain upright. One fragment tore through the superstructure, slicing into radio equipment. Another ripped across the deck, gouging metal and sending smoking debris tumbling into the scuppers. But the guns kept firing. Steady, determined, unbroken. Roberts now turned again, maneuvering into a zigzag that pushed her engines to their very limits. The helm strained against each adjustment. The hull groaned with each angle. Water foamed violently along her sides. Her captain was pushing her beyond every figure printed in her design manual. She was no longer a ship operating with intolerance. She was a ship operating on willpower, but even willpower has its breaking point. A Japanese battleship, one far too large to have the Roberts even register on its scale, now adjusted its guns. The massive barrels of a forward turret swung with eerie slowness toward the tiny silhouette that had become a thorn in the formation's flesh. Observers later identified the ship as Kongō, a veteran battlecruiser with guns capable of smashing entire hulls in a single blow. Kongō fired. The shells descended like falling moons, vast shrieking masses of steel that split the sky with terrifying velocity. The first slammed into the water near Roberts' bow, washing her deck in a collapse of white water. The next exploded off her stern, spraying shrapnel across the aft gun. The concussion shock knocked several crewmen to the deck. For a moment, the ship seemed encased in a world of smoke and shattering spray, and then a shell struck home. It hit near the superstructure, detonating with brutal force. Steel buckled, bulkheads warped. A fire ignited along a section of the deck, sending orange flames flickering against the grey backdrop of the sky. Men scrambled for extinguishers, hauling hoses, hacking through debris, all while the ship continued firing, continued maneuvering, continued presenting herself as a target. The Japanese could not safely ignore. Now came the most desperate phase of the battle. The Roberts was no longer simply damaged, she was bleeding. Fires crept along wiring runs, smoke seeped into compartments, steam lines hissed dangerously from cracked fittings. One engine was showing pressure instability, yet the ship refused to slow down. The engineering crew fed air, fuel, and water into the boilers with a determination that bordered on defiance. Above them, the aft gun crew performed a miracle. Despite the hits, despite the shrapnel, despite the wounded men now working through pain and shock, they accelerated their firing rate. In one stretch of the battle, later described in reports almost with disbelief, they fired as rapidly as a battleship's secondary battery. Their shells landed around a Japanese cruiser so persistently that its captain was forced to shift course, throwing the entire formation into a momentary cascade of readjustments. That moment, one tiny adjustment forced by a tiny ship, changed everything. The Japanese advance slowed. Every second now was life for the carriers. Every second now was survival for pilots circling overhead. Every second now was history being rewritten by a ship that should have been overwhelmed 15 minutes into the battle. Then came the hit that broke her back. A shell, likely from a cruiser this time, struck low along the hull, punching in armor plating and sending a violent blast ripping through compartments below the waterline. The shock rolled through the ship like a physical wave. Men were thrown, lights flickered, water surged in. Damage control crews thundered down ladders with shoring materials and pumps. The Roberts' hull was now compromised, but she did not stop firing. She had reached the breaking point, yet she refused to break. Now came the last minutes of her fight, the last stretch where courage alone kept her alive. Her forward gun blazing, her aft gun glowing red-hot, her torpedo crews reloading with bare hands, her engines running at speeds no engineer had ever intended. She had taken hit after hit, 10 major impacts in 80 minutes. Each one could have been her end. None of them were, but the storm had not finished with her. The next salvo was already inbound. When the final Japanese shells fell around Samuel B. Roberts, the ocean was already shifting from the violence of battle into the eerie stillness that follows it. Smoke drifted in long, thin strands across the water. Burning oil slicks glimmered on the surface, reflecting a sky that seemed too calm for the destruction below. The escort carriers were still withdrawing to the east, rattled and wounded but alive, because the tiny ships behind them had chosen to stand and bleed in their place. Roberts, battered beyond recognition, now struggled to maintain buoyancy. Her hull, torn open by repeated impacts, had begun taking on water faster than pumps could handle. The list grew slowly at first, barely perceptible to men too busy fighting fires to notice. But with each minute, the tilt increased. Debris filled the scuppers. Smoke curled around the wounded superstructure. The deck was warped, bent by concussions, stained by oil and flame. The guns, which had fired until their barrels glowed a dull red, had finally gone silent. The Japanese fleet, staggered by the ferocity of the American defense, had lost momentum and clarity. Admiral Kurita, unsure whether he was fighting carriers, battleships, or some unknown American force, hesitated. Reports from his cruisers were conflicting. Damage was mounting. Aircraft from the escort carriers and nearby groups were striking from unexpected angles. The battlefield had become chaotic, and in that chaos, Samuel B. Roberts had done the unthinkable. Her attacks, torpedo strikes, gunfire harassment, relentless maneuvering, had created enough confusion and disruption to fracture the Japanese offensive. Combined with the fury of the destroyers Hola, Herman and Johnston, the Roberts' actions helped convince Kurita that he had stumbled into a major American naval force. Instead of crushing the carriers, the Japanese turned away. The moment Kurita reversed course, the strategic outcome of the battle shifted permanently. But on the deck of Roberts, victory meant little in the face of survival. The list had increased to a critical angle. Water surged into compartments that damage control teams could no longer reach. The ship's trembling slowed, not from stabilizing, but from dying. The iron heartbeat of her engines faltered. The order to abandon ship was given. Men moved with the grim steadiness of those who had already given everything. They helped the wounded to life rafts, carried shipmates whose injuries prevented movement, and checked compartments for anyone trapped. Smoke and steam filled the air. The deck tilted sharply now, throwing loose equipment sliding toward the starboard rail. Some men hesitated before leaving their battle stations, a reluctance born not from fear, but from the weight of walking away from a ship they had kept alive far longer than anyone could have expected. Roberts had been more than steel. She had been the embodiment of their defiance. Within minutes of the final evacuation, Samuel B. Roberts rolled to starboard. Her hull rose briefly, exposing the scars carved by shells and shrapnel, the bent plates, the ruptured seams. Then she slipped beneath the waves stern first, disappearing into the deep with the quiet dignity of a ship that had fought beyond the limits of possibility. The ocean closed over her. The ripples faded. The smallest destroyer escort at the battle off Samar was gone. But her impact had already shaped the course of the day. Taffy 3 survived. The escort carriers survived. The beachhead at Leyte remained secure. The Japanese offensive shattered against a wall of American courage they never expected to face. When survivors of the Roberts were rescued, many clung to debris or rafts for hours, exposed to sun, exhaustion, and shock. Their accounts, given later to naval historians and investigators, described the battle with a mixture of precision and disbelief. They spoke of firing rates far beyond regulation, of torpedo crews reloading with burned hands, of shells so close they felt the vacuum of their passage, of a ship damaged again and again, yet refusing to stop. The numbers told only part of the story: 10 major hits in 80 minutes, dozens of near misses, thousands of fragments. The real truth was found in the behavior of her crew: coordinated, disciplined, fearless. In post-war analysis, the Roberts earned a title rarely bestowed on a ship so small, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Her legacy spread through naval academies and fleet training lectures. She became the symbol of what small ships could do in the face of overwhelming odds. Her story joined those of Johnston and Hull in defining the Battle off Samar as one of the most heroic moments in American naval warfare, a moment when destroyer escorts and destroyers, outnumbered and outgunned, turned the tide of a battle they should not have survived. Historians would later note that no metric tonnage, armor thickness, gun caliber, speed could explain Samuel B. Roberts' performance. Technical specifications collapsed in the face of what her crew achieved. Her survival time under battleship fire defied expectation. Her damage output exceeded theoretical limits. Her ability to disrupt a cruiser division was unprecedented. But to the men who served aboard her, the explanation was simpler: they had a job to do. They did it until the ship sank beneath them. And because of them, thousands of other Americans lived. The waves rolled gently over the empty patch of ocean where the Roberts had vanished. The battlefield's noise had faded. The sky was clearing. The storm of steel was gone. What remained was a name carved into the legacy of naval warfare, a name spoken with reverence across generations of sailors: USS Samuel B. Roberts, DV 413. The smallest ship that chose the largest fight, and changed the course of a battle.